For decades, the biggest rivalry in personal computing seemed impossible to erase. Windows represented the closed commercial world of Microsoft, while Linux became the symbol of freedom, open-source innovation, and complete control. Millions of users believed these two operating systems would always remain opposites. But something remarkable has been happening behind the scenes. Without making a dramatic announcement or changing the Windows logo, Microsoft has quietly been adopting more and more ideas that once belonged exclusively to Linux. Evidence has been piling up for years, and by the end of this video, you'll realize that Windows today looks far more like Linux than most people have noticed. To understand why this shift is so surprising, we need to go back in time. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Microsoft and the Linux community stood on opposite sides of the software world. Linux was built by thousands of developers working together, sharing code freely, while Microsoft relied on proprietary software and tightly controlled every part of Windows. Back then, very few people would have believed that Microsoft would ever embrace Linux in any meaningful way. Yet technology has a way of changing even the strongest opinions. One of the biggest turning points came when cloud computing started taking over the internet. Companies like Amazon, Google, and countless startups began relying heavily on Linux servers because they were stable, secure, and incredibly flexible. Today, the overwhelming majority of servers powering websites, streaming services, artificial intelligence, and cloud infrastructure run Linux. Microsoft quickly realized that ignoring Linux wasn't just limiting its business, it was risking its future. Instead of fighting Linux forever, Microsoft began learning from it. The first clear proof appeared with Microsoft's own cloud platform, Azure. While many expected Microsoft's cloud to focus almost entirely on Windows Server, the opposite happened. Linux became one of the most important operating systems running inside Azure. Reports from Microsoft executives over the years have confirmed that a significant portion of Azure workloads rely on Linux. Instead of forcing customers to choose Windows, Microsoft chose to support Linux because that's what businesses actually wanted. Then came one of the most unexpected announcements in Microsoft's history: the Windows Subsystem for Linux. Commonly known as WSL, at first glance it sounded like a small developer feature. In reality, it represented a massive philosophical shift. Windows users could suddenly run Linux distributions directly inside Windows without creating virtual machines or rebooting their computers. Ubuntu, Debian, Fedora, Kali Linux, and several other distributions became available almost as if they were native Windows applications. For software developers, this completely changed daily workflows. Developers no longer had to choose between Windows for productivity and Linux for programming. They could open a Linux terminal, install Linux packages, run bash scripts, compile applications, and access familiar command line tools without ever leaving Windows. The operating system that once viewed Linux as its biggest competitor was now shipping Linux functionality as one of its strongest features. Microsoft didn't stop there. The company continued improving WSL until it included a real Linux kernel maintained by Microsoft itself. This wasn't a simple emulator or compatibility layer anymore. Windows was actually running a genuine Linux kernel inside the operating system. Microsoft even started delivering kernel updates through Windows Update, ensuring Linux received the same level of maintenance as core Windows components. That decision alone would have seemed impossible just 15 years ago. Another powerful sign can be found in Microsoft's own software strategy. One by one, the company began releasing major development tools on Linux. Visual Studio Code became one of the most popular code editors across Windows, Linux, and macOS. GitHub, now owned by Microsoft, continues to support developers regardless of which operating system they use. Microsoft's .NET platform also became open source and cross-platform, allowing developers to build applications that run on Linux just as easily as they run on Windows. Even Microsoft's attitude toward open source software changed dramatically. Years ago, contributing to open source projects would have seemed completely out of character for Microsoft. Today, Microsoft actively contributes code to thousands of open source projects. The company has become one of the largest contributors on GitHub, participating in Linux-related development, cloud technologies, programming languages, and developer tools. This isn't simply public relations, it reflects a fundamental change in how Microsoft builds software. Windows itself has quietly adopted many ideas that Linux users have enjoyed for years. Package managers are a perfect example. Linux distributions have long allowed users to install software using simple terminal commands. Instead of visiting websites and downloading installers one by one, Linux users could install applications directly from trusted repositories. Microsoft eventually introduced Windows Package Manager, also known as Winget, bringing a similar experience to Windows users and making software installation much faster and more organized. The Windows terminal is another example that often goes unnoticed. Older versions of Windows relied on the traditional command prompt, which lacked many modern features. The new Windows terminal offers multiple tabs, customizable themes, GPU acceleration, Unicode support, and seamless integration with PowerShell, Command Prompt, Azure Cloud Shell, and Linux terminals through WSL. The overall experience feels remarkably similar to modern Linux terminal environments that developers have appreciated for years. Microsoft has also embraced container technology, another area heavily influenced by Linux. Docker transformed software deployment by allowing applications to run consistently across different environments. Although Docker now supports Windows, its foundations are deeply connected to Linux kernel features. Microsoft recognized this trend and integrated Docker support into Windows while encouraging developers to build cloud-native applications that often rely on Linux containers running behind the scenes. Artificial intelligence has accelerated this transformation even further. Most AI frameworks, including TensorFlow, PyTorch, and many machine learning tools, perform best on Linux. Data scientists and AI researchers overwhelmingly prefer Linux environments because of compatibility and performance advantages. Instead of asking researchers to abandon Linux, Microsoft optimized Windows so these Linux-based AI workflows could run efficiently through WSL, making Windows a more attractive platform without forcing developers to change their habits. Security provides another interesting comparison. Linux has traditionally earned a reputation for stability and predictable security updates. Microsoft has spent years redesigning Windows security architecture, introducing features like virtualization-based security, sandboxing, application isolation, secure boot improvements, and enhanced kernel protections. While Windows remains fundamentally different, many of these improvements reflect lessons learned from decades of Linux development and enterprise security practices. Even Microsoft's internal culture has changed. Executives who once viewed Linux primarily as competition now openly praise its importance within the technology ecosystem. Engineers regularly present Linux-related projects at developer conferences. Microsoft documentation encourages developers to use Linux tools alongside Windows tools instead of treating them as opposing choices. The message has shifted from competition to compatibility, and that change has influenced nearly every modern Microsoft product. Of course, Windows hasn't actually become Linux. The Windows NT kernel still powers the operating system, and millions of familiar Windows applications continue to run exactly as they always have. The graphical interface, driver model, software ecosystem, and overall user experience remain distinctly Windows. But that's exactly what makes Microsoft's strategy so clever. Instead of replacing Windows, the company has quietly infused it with the strengths that made Linux so successful among developers and enterprises. Some people believe Microsoft is simply borrowing useful features, while others argue that Windows is gradually evolving into a hybrid environment where Windows and Linux coexist. Regardless of which perspective you support, the direction is impossible to ignore. Nearly every major release of Windows introduces deeper Linux integration, better command line experiences, stronger open-source support, and more developer-friendly tools inspired by the Linux ecosystem. Perhaps the most fascinating part of this entire story is that Microsoft didn't win by defeating Linux, and Linux didn't replace Windows on billions of personal computers. Instead, the two worlds began influencing each other in ways almost nobody predicted. Microsoft discovered that embracing Linux made Windows stronger, while Linux benefited from Microsoft's contributions to open-source development, cloud infrastructure, and cross-platform software. Competition gradually evolved into collaboration. The next time someone says Windows and Linux are complete opposites, remember what's happening beneath the surface. Every Linux distribution available through WSL, every open-source project backed by Microsoft, every developer writing code across both platforms, and every cloud server running Linux inside Microsoft's own infrastructure tells the same story. Microsoft isn't abandoning Windows, but it's quietly reshaping it using ideas that Linux proved were worth adopting. The transformation hasn't happened overnight, and it isn't finished yet. But once you start connecting all these pieces together, one conclusion becomes difficult to ignore. The future of Windows may not be about competing with Linux anymore. It may be about becoming just enough like Linux to stay relevant for the next generation of computing.